Hey everyone, and welcome to part 2 of my video series on story structure. This one is Act 2, No Turning Back. So we've already talked a little bit about Act 1 and all the things that need to be done in order for Act 1 to be a successful start to your story. Now, when we're talking about Act 2, this is after the point where the main characters have been set on their course. So this means that they have to go forward in order to proceed one way or the other. Now, Act 2 has a lot of important jobs, as do all 4 acts, but particularly, Act 2 is a little bit of where you have, I guess, a little more flexibility. Because, Act 1, all of those jobs kind of need to happen more or less in a specific order. Again, I guess you can work them out in different ways depending on your style, but generally speaking, Act 2 has a little bit more fluidity to the structure of it, I would say, than Act 1 would, because Act 1 kind of has to follow a certain pattern. And Act 2 has a little bit more flexibility as you get to the middle of your story. Now, Act 2 can be basically defined as the space between the point when your character becomes committed to whatever it is that they're trying to accomplish and the middle of the story when things don't quite go right. Now, I'll refer to this as the Inevitable Downturn in more detail later, but suffice to say that this is the middle of the story when something has not gone according to plan. And this is what drives the story towards the third and fourth acts. Now, it kind of has to happen this way in the structure, because if the plan works, then, that kind of is it. That really just doesn't really give you as many places to go, because, one of the things about story is that if things are going well, it kind of doesn't result in a good story, because your character doesn't have anything to overcome. And, not to say that you can't have, happy stories or slice of life stories where it's like there's not an imminent disaster. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am trying to say is that when you're working on, 4-act structure, usually right around the middle is when something happens to change pretty much everything, and in some ways reset you to zero, but in other ways it just kind of pushes your main character further along with his narrative progress, and that's kind of what Act 2 is designed to get you towards. Now, the intermediate acts, they kind of have, I guess, a lot of flexibility, because, Acts 2 and 3 can be done so many different ways. But a couple of things that I would say do need to come out in Act 2 at some point. And mind you that pretty much all of these, except for the last one, can be in any order, really. Some of these can even take place in Act 1, I guess, if you depending on how you lay things out. But Act 2 is when your main characters come up with a plan. This is when we have identified the problem, we know what the central conflict is, and we have an idea on how we're going to go about solving it. Now, this doesn't mean that we have everything worked out yet, but it means that at the very least you have a direction. That, you're going to go find, the MacGuffin of the story, that you need to try and, date your romantic love interest, whatever it is that the story is about. This is when you're going to figure out how you're going to try and get that accomplished. Now, again, the plan does not have to be complete. It doesn't have to necessarily even be a good plan, but you have to have an idea of how you're going to proceed, because that is exactly what the character is going to spend the majority of Act 2 trying to do, carrying out the plan. So, obviously the plan details will vary depending on your story, and there's a lot of things that can and will happen. But what ultimately needs to happen now that the character has a plan is that it's not going to go smoothly. Now, the following 3 things that I'm going to talk about, again, can be done pretty much in any order. 1 or 2 of them can even be done in Act 1 if that's what you want. But these things do need to happen at least by the end of Act 2 for everything to flow. So, one of the major jobs that must happen by Act 2, and again, you can do this in Act 1 if you want, but Act 2 you must introduce the antagonist by this point. Once we've reached somewhere in Act 2, we need to have an idea of what they're facing. Now, mind you that this doesn't mean that the hero or protagonist and the antagonist have to actually meet in Act 2. That can be put off, that can be rushed a little sooner, but the main thing is that we have to know who the antagonist is as the audience. Again, they don't have to meet. It's like we don't have to have the hero and the antagonist running into each other, but they do need to be introduced in some capacity. Now again, like I said before, you can do this in Act 1 right at the beginning if you really want to. It's like when they introduce Darth Vader in A New Hope, it's like he's there in the first 5 minutes and you know who the antagonist is, but you don't have to. But at latest Act 2, you have to introduce the antagonist, if not them in person, at least the organization that they represent. The evil empire, the head vampire, whatever it is that your character is going to be struggling against, we need to see some of their influence in Act 2. Now, most of the time I introduced my antagonist by this point, I think, or you at least see, their henchmen or something, but you need to have an idea of what is going to get in the hero's way, what's going to keep the protagonist from accomplishing his goals. And we need at least Act 2, because if you wait too much longer, and I kind of can see, you can just hint at them if that's what your story's about, but you need to make sure that there's enough time so that the antagonist has enough gravitas, enough presence, enough of a role in the story, so that your heroes, can have a satisfying battle against them once they reach the conclusion. Or just that if it's a romance story, here you would introduce a romantic rival or a challenger or something to keep the protagonist from getting their partner, from getting their desired love interest. And this is all about, like I said, ways to complicate the plan, because now that they know what they're going to do, somebody has to stand in the way of that in some way, shape, or form. Now, this is also, and this is kind of a little bit of a nebulous thing, but here's where things get complicated. Act 2 is all about making the story, the situation, a lot more complicated than it was in Act 1. It's like Act 1, you figure out what you want, and you have a plan to get it. But Act 2 has to introduce levels of complication, things that will make things more difficult for the hero to get where he's going, and that's a lot of what Act 2 is. Introducing the antagonist is part of that. It's like things need to get difficult. Whatever the plan is, you need to run into obstacles or, things that might change the perspective a little bit. And this is where things get complicated, in a number of ways. The characters' relationships will get deeper. Maybe there's things hinted at. And suffice it to say that the big part of Act 2 is making it a reasonable enough challenge for your main characters so that they have to work a little harder to get to where they're going. And maybe there's bits of stuff that you're setting up for later, things that are set into motion that will come and be paid off either at the end of Act 2 or at the beginning of Act 3. But now's the time to plant those seeds of complexity so that they can bear fruit later. And it's really important that Act 2 especially is when things start to look like, I don't know, maybe you come across things you didn't know before, that your character's out of their comfort zone, and it's important that Act 2 kind of emphasizes that a lot. Things are not like they were gonna be before. It's like one way or the other, there's gonna be some collateral damage, emotionally speaking. It's like succeed or fail. You're not going to get out of a romantic relationship without some heartache. You're not going to save the empire without maybe losing a companion or something. Something has to happen to make the hero realize that this is going to cost him, and that this is going to be more of a challenge than they anticipated. This is, something has to bring that gravity home. And I guess that the next thing that we need to see sometime during Act Two is the characters. They have to get, and this is I guess a little bit subjective, new information and or a plot twist. Now this kind of also can come, I guess, at the end of Act Two, combined with the final piece. But particularly, it's like once you've determined what exactly the plan is, well, now you've got to figure out bits and pieces. This is where you expand on the lore. The characters start to learn things that they haven't already known, and this changes their worldview. This, maybe you've discovered that, somebody has been keeping secrets. That there's more to the story than you thought in Act One. Now this again kind of blends with the previous and the next thing. Here's where things get complicated, and of course the defining final event of Act Two. But I mean, what I think makes this one its own individual item is that this doesn't necessarily have to blend with anything else, but it's when things in Act Two, you start to see possibilities, and it's not just a matter of making the story more complex, but it's about presenting things to the audience and to the other characters that things have more layers to them than you thought, and that particularly may mean good things. It could mean bad things. Maybe this is when two characters realize that they have feelings for each other, or something. But it's going to be one of those pieces where you need to plan for how things are going to, I guess, reach fruition in Act 3 and Act 4. And, the new information / plot twist, it's like I was trying to come up with a couple of things for each respective act, and it does kind of blend into those other things. But, I also kind of want to just call attention to the fact that, plot twists, there are going to be a lot of plot twists. There are going to be, a lot of bits of new information. But, I mean, particularly this is just something to think about when you're developing your story, your characters in your world, that, Act 2 is when, things are going to move to another level. Things are not just going to be the same. Now that you've reached the point of no return, things are also going to sort of change as a result of that. And, not just a matter of the situation being more complicated, but also just, everything. So, I really think that's something to keep in mind. And the last thing that I want to talk about with Act 2 is the final defining event of Act 2. You know how we said earlier that Act 1 ends with the point of no return? Once your character's committed, that's Act 1. Then, you have to be able to, as the author, point to a point that says, this is where my character can't go back to where he was before. This is the point at which I'm committed. And Act 2 has what we call the inevitable downturn. This is when the plan doesn't work, suffice it to say, simply put. It's when a traitor is revealed, when the bad guys beat you to the thing. It's like, whatever the case may be, the plan that you had at the beginning of Act 2 clearly doesn't work. And whatever happens at the end of Act 2, the inevitable downturn, this is going to lead your main character into basically a bad spot. This is going to start their downturn, and the downturn of the story, because now you have to come up with a new plan. And I'll talk a lot about specifically what this leads to in my video on Act 3, but what you really need to focus on here is that the plan that you were working towards in Act 2, that didn't work. And how that comes out and what you do with it is, of course, again, subjective to what kind of story you're trying to tell. But, that you've reached the end of Act 2 when whatever it is you thought was going to, whatever you thought you were going to achieve, things didn't quite work out that way. And, the first, the moment where you realize that, the plan is just not going to progress any further. That whatever obstacle you've thrown in your character's path has made plan A no longer a viable option. That is when you are starting to head into Act 3 territory. So, by the middle of the story, you have your inciting incident which got the story started. You've met your main characters. The stage is set. The conflict is clear. And your characters are committed. So now, Act 2, you had a plan. You introduced an antagonist. Things get more complicated. You've learned things about each other. And then all of a sudden, just as you think you're about to accomplish what you set out to do, things get problematic. And this is where we go into Act 3, which I call, well, that didn't work. So I'll see you all next time. If you like werewolves, check out my book Blue Moon, available in paperback and ebook on Amazon. Thanks for watching. If you liked it, click the subscribe button and leave a comment below. Catch you later.